Hey guys, I was on this GitHub page looking through the finished proposals of ECMAScript, the things that's coming to JavaScript, and the ones that I was looking at were the ones that's coming in 2020. Now, probably the two most important ones that I will personally be using, and you should be too, is optional chaining and knowledge coalescing operator. However, we will not be talking about those today, as I've already made a video about those two. You can find the links in the description below. I highly encourage you guys to watch that if you guys haven't been using these already. But today, what this video is all about is Promise.all settled. So this is coming to JavaScript in 2020. Now I'm on this page, and this table is what I'm interested in. So there are 4 methods that promises have, and these are the 4. Now 2 of these already exist in the JavaScript ecosystem. That is Promise.all and Promise.race. The one that's coming this year in the year 2020 is Promise.all.settled. By the time you're watching this video, you may already even be able to start using it. But as of now, we can't. We need some special tools to use it right now. And another thing is Promise.any is in a separate proposal that is coming soon to JavaScript. So this is currently in stage 3. Promise.any is in stage 3. If you don't know what that means, pretty much it means it's gonna come to JavaScript sooner or later, probably in the next few years. So let's play around with all 4 of these. So how are we gonna play around with these? I'm gonna install this package called core.js and use Node with this. So pretty much this allows you to use all the proposed things in your application. Long story short. All right, so let's go jump into our code editor. I'm in an empty folder right now. And I'm just gonna do, let's see, make sure you have Node installed, by the way. I'm gonna do npm init. Yes. Just press enter. All right, and then I'm gonna do npm install core.js, core-js. Wait for that to finish. That finished pretty quick. And then within my folder, I'm gonna make a file called index.js, and this will be our testing playground. But before we go on, we have to, let's see what they say. We just have to import core.js. Because Node doesn't allow that syntax, we're just gonna require core-js. So now we have imported every single polyfills that core.js has, so we could use Promise.all settled and Promise.any. We could pretty much play around with all the promises here. All right, so before we start playing around with these, let's get a couple things set up. I'm gonna make a couple promises here for us to play around with. All right, so I'm gonna make 3 promises here, and these will mock like a call to an external API. So you know when you make a request to an external API, you gotta wait a little bit until the response comes back, right? So we're gonna kind of pretend that we're doing that with these 3 promises. So we're gonna make functions that returns promises. Now let's write these together. First one, I will call it promise1. Is gonna be a function that returns a new promise. Now within the promise, this is a standard procedure here. We put a function here. The first parameter is another function called resolve. The next one is another function called reject. Now to simulate an API call, we're gonna put a set timeout here to give it some time before one of these 2 happens. Let's say the promise1 will take 500 milliseconds, and we will say resolve, and we write the data that we're giving, what the promise is, the data of the promise, and we will say promise1 resolved. I'm also gonna put a reject here, calling it promise1 rejected with a sad face. However, I'm gonna comment this out and use it later maybe. All right, so here is promise1. Let's just copy this thing. We're gonna make 2 more. So 1, 2. Let's call the second one promise2 and change these to promise2 and make it 600 milliseconds this time. And how about promise3? We'll make it 700 milliseconds and call these promise3. Okay, so we have 3 promises that's pretending to be a backend API call. We want to use them. So in order to use them, I'm going to make an async function here called fetch data. Async. And after we make this function, we're not done with it yet. We're just going to call it. And let's do this. All right. So the first promise that I want us to look at is Promise.all. Now, many of you guys probably already use Promise.all, so this will be a quick review. But for those that don't, let me show you guys why it's useful. So normally, how will we get these data here? Like Promise1 result, Promise2 result, Promise3 result. So one thing you could do within an async function, by the way, before we make any backend API calls, we should always put a try and catch here in case there is an error. If we have an error, I'm going to console log error, whoops, and comma the error itself. All right, so one way we could do this is just to await, let's do this, const response1 await promise1 call, and just do that 3 times, right? 2, 3 for all 3 promises, like so. So this is one way to do it. Now, after we do this, let's just console log what the responses were. Response1, let me just put commas here, response2, response3. So I'm gonna go open up my terminal, which is already open here, and I'm gonna run node index.js. And it says here, Promise1 result, Promise2 result, Promise3 result. So this is one way to do it, but this is very inefficient because we're running these synchronously. What I mean by that is, let's try this. Well, let's get the time here, const before time, and we will do new date, and const after time, new date. And I want to also console log the subtraction after time minus before time. I'm gonna run this again. We're waiting a little bit, and it took 1 second, 1.8 seconds. So remember, these are milliseconds. Why did it take 1.8 seconds? So this is 500, 600, 1100, 800, 1800. So we're running this one, Promise1. We're waiting until we get the response, and then we run this one, await, and then we run this one, await. That's why it took this much time. This is why Promise.all is so useful. We could run all of these in parallel. So how we do that is just we write it like this. Let's write const response is await promise, capital Promise.all, put an array inside, and within the array, you just write all the promises. So Promise1, Promise2, Promise3, like that. Now, after we get that, let's see what the shape of our response is like. Console.log response from Promise.all, and we will console log the result here. I'm gonna take this out, and let's just get rid of these. Let's see what our response is. It's just this. It gives us back an array with each of the promises in the same order that we listed them here. Now, let's also look at how long it takes for this one. Const before time, new date. Remember the other one, it took like 1.8 seconds. Let's see for this one, const after time, new date. And let's do after time minus before time. Run the code, and it only took us 700 milliseconds. So it runs all of these in parallel, and so pretty much the bottleneck here is the longest one. It's the one that takes the longest. But because they're all running at the same time, that's why it's so much more efficient. And that's why I encourage you guys to use Promise.all whenever you're making more than one request like this. However, again, the focus of this video is the difference between these 4. So it says here, Promise.all short circuits when an input value is rejected. So what does that mean? For us, for our example right now, they all resolve. Notice how we're all calling the resolve function instead of the reject function here, right? So none of these fail. They're all passing. However, what if, let's say, the middle one failed? So instead of having resolve here, let's just reject it like that. And let's try running this again. Now we don't care about the time anymore, so let's get rid of that. I think I convinced you guys already. Let's reject this one, and then let's see what happens. I'll run the code. Let me just clear this. Node.index.js. All right, Promise.to.rejected. So it short circuits as soon as it fails or one of them, it rejects it. So let me just show you guys. Before we either resolve or reject this, let's put a console log in here to see if it runs or not. Promise1 starting. How about that? And here Promise2 starting. And here Promise3 starting. And then let's see what happens. I'm gonna run the code again. So Promise1 starting, Promise2 starting, error. Promise2 rejected, and Promise3 also did start. So they all did start, but the fact that one of them was rejected. So what happens is, let's say we had more codes here, like console log, we are progressing inside the code, and we were gonna do a lot of crazy things here, right? When even just one of them is rejected, what happens with Promise.all is we never get the opportunity to hit this code. As soon as one of these gets rejected, we just get thrown to the catch. And then whatever's inside the catch, that's what happens. So this is Promise.all. Now this can be very useful because, and I use it many times at my work as a React developer, my React projects, because we're many times waiting for many calls, many backend API calls, and as soon as one of them is rejected, we know something's wrong, so we throw them an error and we show them an error message. However, another thing that currently exists in JavaScript is this Promise.race, and how this is different than Promise.all is it short circuits when the input value is settled. So what does that mean? So what this means is settled means either rejected or resolved, one of those two. As long as it either got resolved, it was successful, or it got rejected, it failed, that's when it short circuits, the first one. So let's go back to our code editor. Now we know out of the three promises, the first one will finish first, right? The first one will settle first. Let's get rid of these annoying console logs. Pretty much for all four promise functions that we're gonna go over today, they're always gonna run. All three of them are always gonna run. So we don't need to see that anymore. And instead of using Promise.all here, let's look at Promise.race. And let's look at what the response from this await Promise.race call is. I'm gonna run the code. It says response from Promise.all. Promise1 result. We are progressing inside the code. So that's just showing us that we're continuing on in the try block. But notice this. Before with Promise.all, we got an array of a responses for all three promises, right? But here we only have Promise1 result. Now check this out. What if this one was actually shorter than the Promise1, meaning this was the shortest one here. This was gonna be the first one to get settled. What would happen then? We run the code and it says error Promise2 rejected. So we couldn't console log any of the response. We got straight thrown to the error and we just console log the error. Meaning this one, it either rejects us right away, either throws an error right away if the first one throws a promise, but if the first one is resolved, is successful, then it only gives us the response from the first promise. Meaning, even if all three of them were successful, or all three of them were resolved, let me put this back to 600, and I run the code, it still only gives us the first one to finish. So when can this possibly be useful? Now, I thought of two different things where this could be useful. The first option where this could be useful is, let's say we're making one call that may take a little bit, right? But let's say sometimes maybe our API is too slow or whatever. It will take more than 10 seconds. We don't want the user to be waiting for 10 seconds and they're just wondering, oh, what's going on? After a certain point, maybe we want to let the user know, hey, look, this is taking too long. We can't wait for this forever. So please, I'm sorry, it failed. So we want to kind of give that user feedback, right? So let's try that. So let's say we want to only give them this promise 3, which takes, remember, 700 seconds. And maybe this was a call to like the user profile page or whatever. And so it will give us some valuable information here, right? But 700 to us is too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another function called const throw error after some time. I don't know, terrible naming, whatever. And this will also be a promise, new promise. However, I'm not going to use a resolve. This will only reject. So I'm just going to put an underscore for the resolve position and use a reject. We're going to set a timeout here. And we're just going to say reject took too dang long. That's going to be a reject message. Our time that we're setting the limit for is 500 milliseconds. So we are pretty much saying with this function, if it takes more than 500 milliseconds, we're just going to let the user know, oh, it took too dang long. So let's grab this function, and within the Promise.race, again, Promise.race, because it only gives you back one of the promises, you don't want to be doing this with multiple functions in here, with multiple promises in here. With only just one, when you want to raise that with this throw error after some time, let's see what happens. Run the code, and it says error took too dang long. Meaning, after a certain time, you could throw in error by making a function like this, a set timeout function, and after X amount of time, throw in error, and then you could let them know, like, I'm sorry, the API sucks, and give them a message so that the user will know, it's not my computer that's at fault, it's not my internet connection that's at fault, it's actually the crappy API that they're using. So this is where this can be useful. Now, another thing that I thought about, like I was trying to force myself to come up with examples to use this, because I'll be honest, I've never actually used race in my code before. I use all the time, Promise.all, I use that all the time, but Promise.race, I've never used it before. So this is one use case here. It's a pretty valuable use case, I would think. But another thing that I thought about, let me just, let's see. They're all resolving, right? Yeah. Another thing that I thought about was this. So let me put back the 3 promises here. Promise 1, Promise 2, Promise 3. Like, what if we had multiple endpoints that grab the same response? Like, let's say, I don't know why this will be the case, but let's say we have multiple endpoints that gave us the same response, and we just wanted to just get the first one because we know that they all give us the same response back, the same data. So we were just racing all of them to give us the data as quickly as possible. So, and then we run the code, and it says here response, and let's just pretend that the response was all the same, right? So then now we got our response, and then we can progress inside our code. However, this poses a problem. What if one of these endpoints failed? So for example, Promise 2 failed. Then what will happen? Remember, these are all getting the same type of data. We're just racing them to get them as soon as possible. But if one of them fails for one reason, then nothing really happens, because look, it still says Promise 1 result. So we still get our data back. But again, this was a case where the first one didn't fail, but not the second one failed. But now this is where this use case gets kind of bad. I don't know what, yeah, pretty crappy. What if the first one was rejected? Remember, we're racing to get, and we're just trying to get the data as soon as possible, right? But what if the first one got rejected? Now let's run the code again. And unfortunately, it says, I'm sorry, the API sucks. Promise one rejected. Meaning we were racing, but the first one failed, so we can't get any of the data, or we lost the data entirely. So this is probably not a good use case for a race. As a matter of fact, if you were ever doing this type of scenario where you have a bunch of endpoints where that gives you the same data, you're just racing to get one, there's actually another one within here that we'll talk about later that you could potentially use. However, the one that I want to talk about now, remember we talked about Promise.all, very useful. Promise.race, when you're trying to get just one data and you have a time limit for that, then it could be useful. The one that I want to talk about now is this Promise.all.settled. So again, this one is coming in JavaScript 2020. It might even be out by the time you're watching this video, but for now we're using core.js to mess around with this. Let's see what this does. Let me just make sure, resolve, reject. Okay, so promise one gets rejected and the other two gets resolved. Let's look at what the response is for Promise.all.settled. Again, I could use this right now because of polyfill due to core.js. Promise.all.settled. Let's see how our shape looks like. Remember, we have one failing test, right? One of the failing promises. And look what it gave back us. It gave us an array with an object that all has a status of either rejected or fulfilled and a reason or a value. So, and notice, even though we had an error, we had a rejection, we never got to this catch block. Meaning, this Promise.all.settled, it never short circuits, it never throws an error. It just gives us back this data so that we can mess with it any way we choose. Maybe what we can do is with our response, after we got our response, let me just erase this. We could just do like object dot for const object, I don't know, const response, singular response of response, and then if singular response dot status is rejected, maybe we could do console log, oh no, this one was rejected, and give them the reason. Singular response dot reason. Else we could console log we got this data back, and instead of reason now we use value. So let's see what that does. I'm gonna run the code again, and it says, oh no, this one was rejected, promise one rejected. We got this data back, promise 2, we got this data back, promise 3. So I guess this all settled, you could use it when you want to really fine tune the type of response, the rejections or the fulfillment that you get. You could really fine tune how you can handle the error without getting automatically thrown to the catch block. So that is one good use case though. But to be honest, personally, I think I'll stick with Promise.all, because usually when I'm making an API call, I want all of them to become fulfilled. But I could see where this could become useful. And again, this one will be coming in 2020, this year. Now, the last one I want to look at is this Promise.any, which is not coming in 2020. It will come probably in the near future, maybe 2021. But let's play around with it here, and let's see what we get for that one. By the way, what does it say here? It says short circuits when an input value is fulfilled. So what does that mean? When an input value is fulfilled. Let's try that. I'm gonna do any now. Let's see what we get. Let's erase this big for loop here and run the code. Clear. It says response from Promise.any Promise.2 results. So we got the result, we got the answer of Promise.2. Our Promise.1, which is the fastest one, it didn't even throw in error, but it gave us back the response from Promise.2, which is the next one. So that's pretty interesting. What if we rejected this one too? Then what would happen with Promise.any? Let's run the code again. And then now it says, even though Promise.1 and Promise.2 were rejected, it still gave us back the answer, the response from Promise.3. Interesting. So what if we were to reject this one as well? Let's run the code. And now it says, I'm sorry, the API sucks. So pretty much it went to the catch and it gives us an aggregate error, no one promise result. All right, so how this any works is it gives you the response of the first one that is fulfilled. The first one that is successful, it gives you back the response of that one. It ignores all the ones that's rejected unless every single promise has been rejected. Then it throws this aggregate error. So this one, I feel like the use case is kind of like my made up hypothetical use case where you have a multiple endpoints where you're getting the same data. You just want to grab one as fast as possible. So you would use this Promise.any because even if the first few ones were rejected for whatever reason, it wouldn't throw an error. It would just wait until you got a proper response. So I guess that's when you could use this. Now, me again, personally, I don't ever see myself calling multiple endpoints for the same response. But who knows? Maybe someone with some crazy application that will make it pretty useful. But anyways, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. This was an overview of all the Promise functions. Promise.all.settled is coming this year. The other two, all and race, you can already use in your code base. I highly encourage you to use Promise.all especially. And Promise.any will be coming soon. However, you could be using these already if you have core.js. Alright guys, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Guys, if you like my content, please click like and subscribe. I will release these type of coding videos on a daily basis. And guys, have a good one and happy coding.